On 10 March, Wilson Brown, his force augmented by Yorktown, launched planes from a point off Port Moresby and flew them over the Owen Stanley Range to pound the Japanese at Lae and Salamaua on the north coast of Papua. That raid, however, paled in comparison with the Halsey Doolittle one on Tokyo in April. As the fleet then had no carrier bombers with enough range to operate from outside the limit of the Japanese offshore air patrol, the Army Air Force lent 16 B-25 Mitchells, which made a deckload for carrier Hornet, Captain Mark A. Mitcher. Enterprise, Captain George D. Murray, went along to provide combat air patrol. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the cruisers and Captain Richard Connolly the destroyers of the screen. Although B-25 pilots could be trained to take off from a carrier, the deck was too short for recovery. So the planes had to fly 668 miles from Hornet's launching point to Tokyo, bomb the city, and thence fly another 1,100 miles to friendly Chinese airfields. The strike group, led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, were airborne by 8:24 a.m. April 18 and over the city by noon. They completely surprised the Japanese as we had been surprised by them at Pearl Harbor, and not one B-25 was lost over Japan. But some made crash landings in China or splashed off the coast, and 2 pilots picked up by the Japanese were executed, an unpleasant practice which persisted through the Pacific War and led to some of the officers responsible being hanged when it was over. This answer to Pearl Harbor did not inflict 1,000th part of the damage it was supposed to revenge, but it gave the American public, which had had nothing but bad news for 19 weeks, a great lift. The Japanese authorities, who never guessed where the bombers came from, President Roosevelt's announcement that they flew from Shangri-La didn't help much, pinned down hundreds of planes to defend Tokyo, and, what is more important, the event expedited plans for an overextension that led to the Japanese defeat at Midway. Strategic overstretch Captain Liddell Hart calls it. Victory disease, a Japanese admiral, named it after the war. Imperial General Headquarters, not content with the most rapid, stupendous conquest made in modern times, now embarked on a plan for still further aggression. First, Tulagi in the Solomons and Port Moresby in Papua would be seized to secure air mastery of the Coral Sea. The combined fleet would cross the Pacific to annihilate the United States Pacific Fleet and at the same time capture Midway Island and the Western Aleutians. Then set up a ribbon defense anchored at Attu, Midway, Wake and the Marshalls and Gilberts. This effort, had it not been thwarted by the Battle of Midway, would have been followed by invasion of New Caledonia, the Fijis and Samoa, to isolate Australia. The one really sound part of this grandiose plan, even though it failed, was Admiral Yamamoto's challenge to the Pacific Fleet. He knew that the destruction of the fleet must be completed before 1943, when American war production would make it too late. With Pacific Fleet wiped out, Japan could make her ribbon defense impregnable and organize her conquests. Americans would tire of a futile war and negotiate a peace which would leave Japan master of the Pacific. Such was the plan and the confident expectation of the warlords in Tokyo. The Coral Sea is one of the world's most beautiful bodies of water. Typhoons pass it by. The southeast trades blow fresh across its surface almost the entire year, raising whitecaps which build up to long surges that crash on Australia's Great Barrier Reef in a 1,500-mile line of white foam. Lying between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, it knows no winter, and the summer is never uncomfortably hot. The islands on the eastern and northern verges, New Caledonia, the New Hebrides, the Louisiades, are lofty, jungle-clad and ringed with coral beaches and reefs. Here the interplay of bright sunlight, pure air and transparent water may be seen at its best. Peacock-hued shoals over the coral gardens break off abruptly from an emerald-hued fringe into deeps of brilliant amethyst. Under occasional overcasts, the Coral Sea becomes a warm dove-grey instead of assuming the bleak dress of the ocean in high latitudes. Only in its northern bight, the Bismarck Sea, does the Coral Sea wash sombre shores of lava and volcanic ash. That bight had been dominated by Japan since January 1942, from her easily won base at Rabaul. It was now time, in the view of her war planners, that she swing around the New Guinea bird's tail and move into the dancing waters of the broad Coral Sea. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Intelligence smoked out the gist of this plan by 17 April, and Admiral Nimitz saw to it that Task Force 17, a two-carrier group, Lexington and Yorktown, under Rear Admiral Fletcher, was there to spoil it. That is why the Coral Sea, where no more serious fights had taken place in days gone by than those between trading schooners and Melanesian war canoes, became the scene of the first great naval action between aircraft carriers, the first naval battle in which no ship on either side sighted the other. The Japanese operation plan was not simple. Her naval strategists believed in dividing forces. There were three main divisions. One, a left-prong, Rear Admiral Shima, to occupy Tulagi in the Lower Solomons and establish a seaplane base whence Noumea could be neutralized. 2, a right-prong Rear Admiral Kajioka's Port Moresby invasion group, floating a sizable army in a dozen transports, covered by heavy cruisers and light carrier Shoho to start from Rabaul, whip through Jomard Passage in the Louisiades, and capture Port Moresby. 3, Vice Admiral Takagi's big carrier striking force, including Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, to enter the Coral Sea from the east, and destroy anything the Allies might offer to interfere with this plan. The whole was to be directed from Rabaul by Commander-in-Chief 4th Fleet, Vice Admiral Inouye. Admiral Nimitz did not have even half this force at his disposal, but he put together under Admiral Fletcher's command all he had, and gave him no more specific orders than to stop the enemy. Fletcher in Lexington, familiar with the Coral Sea, came steaming west from Pearl Harbor. Yorktown, already known as the Waltzing Matilda of the Pacific Fleet, was ordered to cut short a period of upkeep at Tongatabu, waltz over to the Coral Sea, and rendezvous with Lady Lex. Most of the ships of MacArthur's Navy, not yet named 7th Fleet, also joined. These were 3 cruisers, His Majesty's Australian ship Australia and Hobart, USS Chicago, and a few destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral J.G. Crace. The ensuing action was full of mistakes, both humorous and tragic, wrong estimates and assumptions, bombing the wrong ships, missing great opportunities and cashing in accidentally on minor ones. The Japanese won the first trick. Admiral Shima's group occupied Tulagi unopposed on 3 May. They took the second too on 4 May, when Yorktown's planes bombed Tulagi and did only minor damage. At the same time, however, Japan missed her best chance to win this game through false economy. To save an extra ferrying mission, Shokaku and Zuikaku were ordered to deliver 9 fighter planes to Rabaul. This delayed the 2 big carriers 2 days, so that on the 4th they were too far away to counterattack Fletcher. Nothing much happened on the 5th and 6th, when each big carrier force was searching for its enemy without success. At one time, they were only 70 miles apart. That 6th day of May, when General Wainwright surrendered Corregidor in the Philippines, marked the low point of the entire war for American arms. But the next day opened with a bright dawn. This transition from Corregidor to the Coral Sea is startling and dramatic. At dawn on the 7th, Shokaku and Zuikaku sent out a search mission for an enemy force they suspected to be in the Coral Sea. The search planes sighted Fletcher's retiring fueling group, fleet oiler Neosho and destroyer Sims, and made the second big mistake of this error-crowded battle by reporting them to be a carrier and a cruiser. Admiral Takagi promptly ordered an all-out bombing attack on this hapless couple and sank them both. This caused Rear Admiral Hara, the carrier division commander under Takagi, much chagrin, cost him 6 planes, and saved the American carriers from attack. The American planes, however, were off on a similar wild goose chase. That particular boo-boo had resulted from the report of a Yorktown search plane at 8:15 a.m. May 7 of 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers about 175 miles northwest of the American force. Fletcher, naturally assuming that this meant Takagi's striking force, launched full deckloads to go after it. When these aircraft were already airborne, it was discovered that the 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers, owing to a disarrangement of the pilot's code contact pad, should have been reported as 2 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. Nevertheless, by good luck, the Lexington and Yorktown flyers encountered light carrier Shoho, piled in on her, and put her under in a matter of 10 minutes, a record for the entire war. Scratch 1 flat top signalled Lexington's dive bomber commander. It was not the right flat top, but the loss of Shoho so discouraged Admiral Inouye that he ordered the Port Moresby invasion group, instead of pressing on through Jomard Passage, to gill around at a safe distance north of the WWIIs. Thus, our attack on the wrong carrier thwarted the enemy's main object. More grim humour on the 7th was furnished by Crace's chase. Fletcher gallantly weakened his carrier's screen by detaching Rear Admiral Crace with his 2 Australian cruisers, USS Chicago and a few destroyers, to find and attack the Port Moresby invasion force. Crace handled this mixed group so efficiently as to beat off 31 land-based bombers from Rabaul without receiving a scratch, and he also fought off 3 United States Army Air Force B-17s from the Townsville, Queensland base, which thought his ships were Japanese. To cap this comedy, the thwarted Japanese planes claimed to have sunk 2 battleships and a heavy cruiser. Toward evening of the same day, 7 May, Takagi sent a search attack mission to find and bomb Fletcher's carriers. They missed the flat tops, but had a rough experience. First, they were intercepted by Fletcher's fighter planes and lost 9 of their number. Then, after dark, 6 tried to land on Yorktown, mistaking her for Japanese, and 11 more were lost trying to make night landings on their own carriers. On 8 May came the payoff. The 2 major carrier groups under Fletcher and Takagi, or to use the actual officer in tactical commands of the carriers, Fitch and Hara, which had been fumbling for one another for the better part of 3 days and nights, finally came to grips. Each located the other and attacked. Never were forces more even. The Japanese admiral with the Irish name had 121 planes. Jakey Fitch had 122. Hara had a screen of 4 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers. Fitch, now Crace was away, had but 1 more of each type. Nature, however, gave the Japanese carriers one great advantage. They were in a belt of heavy overcast, which had moved into the Coral Sea from the Solomons, whilst the Americans were out in the clear under brilliant sunshine. Thus, the Yorktown attack group, 41 planes strong, missed Zuikaku under a rain squall, concentrated on Shokaku and obtained only 2 bomb hits. But one of these bent the flight deck so that she could no longer launch planes. Half Lexington's attack group failed to find the fog-enshrouded enemy. The other half gave Shokaku another bomb hit. Takagi, who by this time, noon 8 May, believed that both American carriers were sinking, decided he could dispense with the damaged carrier and sent her back to Truk. His assumption was about half correct. The Japanese attack group, amounting to about 70 planes, gave both American carriers a severe working over. Yorktown took 1 bomb hit which killed 66 men. Lexington took 2 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. The end of the battle found Lady Lex listing, with 3 fires burning but her power plant intact. There was every prospect of damage control quenching the fires, when suddenly she was racked by 2 internal explosions which forced Captain Frederick Sherman to abandon ship. This was done skillfully, some 150 wounded being lowered in basket stretchers into motor whaleboats, while the able-bodied slid down lines into the water, where they were picked up by destroyers. Rear Admiral Tom Kincaid, who handled these rescue operations, showed the qualities that helped him to emerge as one of our great flag officers. Lady Lex, beloved as few warships have been by her crew, some of whom had been on board since she was commissioned in 1927, finally had to be sunk by a friendly destroyer's torpedoes. Her loss gave the Japanese the winning score in tonnage sunk, but that does not register the effect of the battle. Admiral Inouye, fearful of risking the Port Moresby invasion force south of Papua without air cover, ordered it to retire to Rabaul, and never again in this war did the keel of a Japanese warship vex the Coral Sea south of the WWIIs. Thus the battle was really won by the Americans owing to their biggest mistake, the sighting and bombing of Shoho. Her loss led Inouye to throw in the sponge. Even the big carriers battle turned out ill for the Japanese, because Shokaku took 2 months to repair, and Zuikaku took over 1 month to replace her plane losses. Thus, neither big flat top could take part in the great battle coming up, but Yorktown could and did. Even before the sea warriors of Japan began roaring into the Coral Sea, word had reached Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor of a second offensive that threatened to be much the more powerful and dangerous. Imperial General Headquarters issued the order that put the wheels in motion on 5 May 1942. Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet will, in cooperation with the Army, invade and occupy strategic points in the Western Aleutians and Midway Island. The objectives were threefold: The named islands were wanted as anchors in the New Ribbon defense, and Midway too as a base for air raids on Pearl Harbor. But most of all, Admiral Yamamoto intended this operation to draw out and annihilate the United States Pacific Fleet in its hour of greatest weakness, before new construction could replace the losses of Pearl Harbor. The success of this battle was central to the entire Japanese strategic concept of the war. Had Japan won, Port Moresby, Fijis, anything else she wanted, would have fallen into her lap. But the yet small Pacific Fleet declined to accept the sacrificial role. Midway, situated 1,136 miles west-northwest of Pearl Harbor, is the outermost link of the Hawaiian chain. The entire atoll, smaller even than Wake, is but 6 miles in diameter. Only 2 islets, Sand and Eastern, the first less than 2 miles long and the other a little more than 1, are dry land. It had been a Pan-American Airways base since 1935 and a naval air station since August 1941. A comparison of the combined fleet thrown into this operation with what Admiral Nimitz could collect to withstand it indicates that Yamamoto's expectations of annihilation were justified. He commanded 1. An advance force of 16 submarines, 2. Nagumo's Pearl Harbor striking force, with 4 big carriers, 3. A Midway occupation force, some 5,000 men in 12 transports protected by 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers and numerous destroyers, 4. A main body under Yamamoto's immediate command, comprising Japan's 3 most modern battleships and 4 older ones, with a light carrier, and 5. The Northern Area Force, with 2 light carriers, 2 heavy cruisers and 4 big transports for the bombing of Dutch Harbor and occupation of Adak, Attu and Kiska. This added up to 162 warships and auxiliaries, not counting small patrol craft and the like, practically the entire fighting Japanese Navy. The total number that Admiral Nimitz could scrape together was 76, of which 1/3 belonged to the North Pacific Force and never got into the battle. Nevertheless, Nimitz had certain assets which helped tip the scale. The senior commander of the carrier striking force, which did most of the fighting, was Rear Admiral Fletcher in Yorktown, repaired at Pearl Harbor in 2 days, when by peacetime methods it would have taken 90, and Fletcher had learned a thing or two at the Coral Sea. Junior to him, and in temporary command of Halsey's Task Force 16, which had pulled off the Tokyo strike, was Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. He, though not an aviator, showed in the forthcoming battle the very highest quality of tactical wisdom, the power to seize opportunities. Enterprise and Hornet, the carriers under him, had 2 superlative commanding officers, Captains George D. Murray and Marker Mitcher. In Midway itself, where 32 Navy Catalinas and 6 of the new torpedo-bombing Avengers, 54 Marine Corps planes and 23 Army Air Force planes, 19 of them B-17s, were based, we had an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Finally, Nimitz had the inestimable advantage of knowing when and where the enemy intended to attack. But for early and abundant decrypted intelligence, and what was more important, the prompt piecing together of these bits and scraps to make a pattern, David United States Navy could never have coped with the Japanese Goliath. Admiral Nimitz's orders to Fletcher and Spruance were to inflict maximum damage on enemy by employing strong attrition tactics, which meant airstrikes on enemy ships. He cannily ordered them to take initial positions to the northeastward of Midway, beyond search range of the approaching enemy, anticipating that the 700-mile searches by Midway-based planes would locate the Japanese carriers first. To this he added a special letter of instruction. In carrying out the task assigned, you will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces, without good prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy. No commander-in-chief's instructions were ever more faithfully and intelligently carried out. Yamamoto really threw away his chance of a smashing victory by dividing his mammoth forces several ways, and by fitting his operation plan to what he assumed the Americans would do. Dividing forces was a fixed strategic idea with the Japanese. They loved diversionary tactics, fleets popping up at odd places to confuse the enemy and pull him off base. Their pattern for decisive battle was the same at sea as on land: lure the enemy into an unfavourable tactical situation, cut off his retreat, drive in his flanks and then concentrate for the kill. Their manual for carrier force commanders even invoked the examples of Hannibal at Cannae and Ludendorff at Tannenberg, probably studied in Schlieffen's works, to justify such naval strategy as Yamamoto tried at Midway. Thus, the preliminary airstrike on Dutch Harbour, set for 3 June, was a gambit to pull the Pacific Fleet up north where it could not interfere with the occupation of Midway Island, due to take place at dawn 6 June. When the Pacific Fleet hastened south after a fruitless run up north, which could not be earlier than 7 June, Japanese carrier planes and Midway-based aircraft would intensively bomb the American ships. These, if they did not promptly sink, would be dispatched by gunfire from Yamamoto's battleships and heavy cruisers. So very, very neat. But Nimitz, instead of falling for this trap, had 3 carriers already covering Midway as Nagumo approached. It was the Nips who were nipped. The Japanese Aleutian prong struck first on 3 June, with the triple object of deceiving Admiral Nimitz into the belief that this was the main show, destroying American installations at Dutch Harbour and covering an occupation of the Western Aleutians. Besides separate occupation forces, Vice Admiral Hosogaya had light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, 3 heavy cruisers and a suitable number of destroyers and oilers. On our side, we had the North Pacific Force commanded by Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald in light cruiser Nashville, with sister ships St. Louis and Honolulu, 2 heavy cruisers, a destroyer division, including a 9-destroyer striking group, 6 S-class submarines and a flock of Coast Guard cutters and other small craft. Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Intelligence smoked out Japanese intentions in this quarter and informed the Admiral of them on 28 May, but Fuzzy Theobald, as usual, thought he knew better, that the enemy was going to seize Dutch Harbour. Consequently, he deployed the main body of his force about 400 miles south of Kodiak, instead of trying to break up the Western Aleutians invasion force. This bad guess lost him all opportunity to fight, for Hosogaya's 2 light carriers, under the tactical command of Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, slipped in between Theobald's force and the land, began bombing Dutch Harbour at 8 a.m. June 3, and returned through a fog mole for another whack at this Eastern Aleutians base next day, completely unmolested from the sea. The Japanese could have landed at Dutch Harbour, for all the protection it had from Theobald. Considerable damage was inflicted on this base, but it was far from being knocked out. On 7 June, undefended Attu and Kiska in the Western Aleutians were occupied by the Japanese according to plan, but Adak was not taken, because it seemed to be too near Unmak. Army P-40s based on the new Army Air Force or Forces Field at Unmak had given Kakuta's carrier planes quite a run for their money. Turning now to the main show, Old Man Weather seemed determined to help the Japanese here, as in the Coral Sea. Admiral Nagumo's striking force, built around carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor, advanced toward Midway under heavy cloud cover. They could even hear the island-based search planes buzzing overhead, but themselves were not seen. The force allotted to occupy Midway was, however, sighted by a Catalina on 3 June. Captain Simard's island-based air force reacted quickly, though ineffectively. It made but one hit on an oiler at 1:43 a.m. June 4. That was the first blow in this battle south of the Aleutians. All night, 3 to 4 June, the 2 opposing carrier forces were approaching each other on courses which, if maintained, would have crossed a few miles north of Midway Island. Day began to break around 4 a.m. It was still overcast over the Japanese, clear over the Americans. A light wind blew from the southeast, another break for the Japanese. Since wind is almost as important for aircraft carriers as for the old frigates, contrary to what was desirable in the sailing navy to get the weather gauge of your enemy, the lee gauge was now wanted, because a carrier has to steam into the wind to launch or recover planes. Thus, Fletcher and Spruance, having the weather gauge, had to lose mileage during flight operations. Yorktown, having to recover a search mission, had to lag behind when the big news arrived, shortly after 6 a.m. June 4. This news was a Midway-based PBY's contact report of 2 Japanese carriers, headed southeast. For 4 hours this was all the information that Fletcher and Spruance had of Nagumo's location and course, but it was enough. Fletcher promptly ordered Spruance, with Enterprise and Hornet, to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located, promising to follow as soon as his search planes were recovered. Both admirals knew very well that Nagumo's striking force was Yamamoto's jugular vein, and that their only hope was to cut it. 10 minutes after Fletcher issued that pivotal order, the next phase of the Battle of Midway opened over the island itself. 108 Japanese planes, divided evenly between fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, took off from the 4 carriers before sunrise. Midway search radar picked them up 93 miles away, and every fighter on the island was scrambled to intercept, but they were too few, and the Marine Corps Buffaloes too weak and slow to stop the Japanese. The bombing of Midway began at 6:30 a.m. and continued for 20 minutes. It did considerable ground damage without breaking up the runways, and Midway anti-aircraft fire was very good. Between that and the Marine fighters, 15 of which were lost, about 1/3 of the Japanese attack group was shot down or badly damaged. In the meantime, 4 waves of American Midway-based bombers had flown off to counterattack Nagumo's carriers. They, too, lost heavily, but, as we shall see, their sacrifice was not in vain. Now came the most decisive moment in a battle filled with drama. Admiral Nagumo, when sending off that 108-plane strike on Midway, reserved 93 aircraft armed with bombs and torpedoes to deal with enemy ships, if he could find any. Usually the Japanese were smarter than we in air search, but this time they failed, largely because, according to the Japanese plan, no American carriers should have been around for a couple of days. So Nagumo sent only a few cruiser float planes on routine search, and by 7 a.m. they had found nothing. At that moment, Lieutenant Tomonoga, commander of what was left of the 108-plane strike then returning to their carriers, signalled to Nagumo that Midway needed another pounding. Immediately after, there came in on the Japanese carriers the first Midway-based bombing attack, which seemed to second Tomonoga's motion. Obviously, Midway had plenty of bite left. So the Admiral broke the spot and ordered the 93 planes struck below to be rearmed with incendiary and fragmentation bombs for use against the island. 15 minutes elapsed, and the Admiral was dumbfounded to receive a search plane's report of 10 enemy ships to the northeast, where no American ships were supposed to be. What to do? Nagumo mulled it over for another quarter hour, cancelled the former change bomb plan, and ordered the 93 planes again rearmed and readied to attack ships. That took time, and it was already too late to fly those planes off to attack enemy ships, because flight decks had to be kept clear to receive the rest of the Japanese aircraft which had been bombing Midway. At 8:35 a.m., when the returning bombers began landing on the Japanese carriers, American birds carrying death and destruction were already winging their way from Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance had taken over from Halsey as Chief of Staff, Captain Miles Browning, one of the most irascible and unstable officers ever to earn a 4th stripe, but a man with a slide-rule brain. Browning figured out that Nagumo would order a second strike on Midway, that he would continue steaming toward the island, and that the golden opportunity to hit his carriers would arrive when they were refueling planes for this second strike. Spruance accepted these estimates and made the tough decision to launch at 7 a.m., when about 175 miles from the enemy's calculated position, instead of continuing for another 2 hours in order to diminish the distance. Spruance also decided to make this an all-out attack, a full deck load of 20 Wildcat fighters, 67 Dauntless dive bombers, and 29 Devastator torpedo bombers, and it took an hour to get all these airborne. Fletcher properly decided to delay launching from Yorktown in case more targets were discovered, but by 9:06 a.m. his 6 fighters, 17 Dauntless dive bomber and 12 Devastator torpedo bomber were also in the air. Imagine, if you will, the tense, crisp briefing in the ready room, the warming up of planes which the devoted ground crews have been checking, arming, fueling and servicing, the ritual of the takeoff, as precise and ordered as a ballet, planes swooping in graceful curves over the ships while the group assembles. This 4th of June was a cool, beautiful day. Pilots at 19,000 feet could see all around a circle of 50 miles radius. Only a few fluffy cumulus clouds were between them, and an ocean that looked like a dish of wrinkled blue Persian porcelain. It was a long flight, and alas, for so many brave young men, a last flight over the superb ocean. Try to imagine how they felt at first sight of enemy flat tops and their wriggling screen, with wakes like the tails of white horses. the sudden catch at their hearts when the black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts came nearer and nearer, then the dreaded Zeeks of Japanese combat air patrol swooping down out of the central blue. And finally, the tight, incredibly swift attack, when a pilot forgets everything but the target so rapidly enlarging, and the desperate necessity of choosing the exact tenth of a second to release and pull out. While these bright ministers of death were on their way, Nagumo's striking force continued for over an hour, as Miles Browning had calculated, to steam toward Midway. The 4 carriers were grouped in a box-like formation in the center of a screen of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers. Every few minutes messages arrived from reconnaissance planes that the enemy was approaching. At 9:05 a.m., just before the last of the planes returning from Midway were recovered, Nagumo ordered striking force to turn degrees left, to course east-northeast, to contact and destroy the enemy task force. His carriers were in exactly the condition that Spruance and Browning hoped to find them, planes being refueled and rearmed in feverish haste. Now came a break for Nagumo. His change of course caused the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet to miss him altogether. Hornet's torpedo bombers, under Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, sighted his smoke and attacked without fighter cover. The result was a massacre of all 15 Devastator torpedo bomber. Every single one was shot down by Zeeks or anti-aircraft fire. Only 1 pilot survived. The torpedo squadron from Enterprise came in next and lost 10 out of 14. Then Yorktown's, which lost all but 4, and not a single hit for all this sacrifice. No wonder that these torpedo bombers, misnamed Devastators, were struck off the Navy's list of combat planes. The 3rd torpedo attack was over by 10:24 a.m., and for about 100 seconds the Japanese were certain they had won the Battle of Midway and the war. This was their high tide of victory. Then, a few seconds before 10:26 a.m., with dramatic suddenness, there came a complete reversal of fortune, wrought by the dauntless dive bombers. The Dauntless dive bomber, the most successful and beloved by aviators of all our carrier types during the war. Lieutenant Commander Clarence W. McCluskey, Air Group Commander of Enterprise, had 2 squadrons of Dauntless dive bomber under him, 37 units. He ordered one to follow him in attacking carrier Kaga, while the other, under Lieutenant W.E. Gallagher, pounced on Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Their coming in so soon after the last torpedo bombing attack meant that the Zeeks were still close to the water after shooting down Devastator torpedo bomber and had no time to climb. At 14,000 feet, the American dive bombers tipped over and swooped screaming down for the kill. Akagi took a bomb which exploded in the hangar, detonating torpedo storage, then another which exploded amid planes changing their armament on the flight deck, just as Browning had calculated. Fires swept the flagship. Admiral Nagumo and staff transferred to cruiser Nagara, and the carrier was abandoned and sunk by a destroyer's torpedo. 4 bomb hits on Kaga killed everyone on the bridge and set her burning from stem to stern. Abandoned by all but a small damage control crew, she was racked by an internal explosion that evening and sank hissing into a 2,600-fathom deep. The 3rd carrier was the victim of Yorktown's dive bombers, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, who by cutting corners managed to make up for a late start. His 17 Dauntless dive bomber jumped Soryu just as she was turning into the wind to launch planes, and planted 3 half-ton bombs in the midst of the spot. Within 20 minutes, she had to be abandoned. United States submarine Nautilus, prowling about looking for targets, pumped 3 torpedoes into her. The gasoline storage exploded, whipsawing the carrier, and down she went in 2 sections. At 10:24 a.m., Japan had been on top. 6 minutes later, on that bright June morning, 3 of her big carriers were on their flaming way to death. But Nagumo did not give up. He ordered Hiryu, the one undamaged carrier, to strike Yorktown. Her 2 attack groups comprised 18 dive bombers, 10 torpedo bombers and 12 fighters. Most of them were shot down by combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire, but 3 Vals of the first strike made as many bomb hits, and 4 Kates, breaking low through a heavy curtain of fire, got 2 torpedoes into Yorktown at 2:45 p.m. These severed all power connections and caused her to list 26 degrees. 15 minutes later, Captain Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. Yorktown's watertight integrity had been impaired in the Coral Sea battle, and her repairs were so hasty that he feared she would turn turtle. Admiral Fletcher, who shifted his flag to cruiser Astoria after the first attack, had already sent out a search mission to find the fourth Japanese carrier. Almost at the same moment that Yorktown was torpedoed, these planes found Hiryu. As a result of their contact, Waltzing Matilda was revenged just as her dancing career ended. Enterprise, at Spruance's command, turned into the wind at 3:30 p.m. and launched an attack group of 24 Dauntless dive bomber, including 10 refugees from Yorktown and veterans of the morning's battle. Led by the redoubtable Gallagher, they jumped Hiryu and her screen at 5 p.m. The carrier received 4 hits which did her in, and she took down with her Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, an outstanding flag officer who, it is said, would have been Yamamoto's successor had he lived. Yamamoto, who according to plan was keeping well to the rear his main body, built around the mastodonic battleship Yamato, first reacted to these events aggressively. He ordered Kakuta's 3 light carriers down from the Aleutians, and Kondo's heavy cruiser covering group to join main body next day, to renew the battle. He still had overwhelming gunfire and torpedo superiority over anything that Spruance and Fletcher could offer. But after news arrived that his 4 splendid carriers were either sunk or burning derelicts, he bowed to the logic of events, and at 2:55 a.m. June 5 ordered a general retirement. He had lost his entire fast carrier group, with their complement of some 250 planes, most of their pilots, and about 10 PM officers and men. In all its long history, the Japanese Navy had never known defeat. No wonder that Yamamoto fell ill and kept close to his cabin during the homeward passage. Never has there been a sharper turn in the fortunes of war than on that June day when McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers snatched the palm of victory from Nagumo's masthead, where he had nailed it on 7 December. The 4th of June, day that should live forever glorious in our history, decided the Battle of Midway. By destroying the 4 Japanese carriers and their air groups, the American aviators had extracted the sting from combined fleet.